Hey church, today we are in 1 Samuel 21. The setup is in 1 Samuel 20. David just found out without a doubt that Saul is after him and wants to kill him. And so now he is officially on the run. In verse 1, it says, Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, Why are you alone and no one with you? This gives us a little insight into kind of the predicament that David is facing. David is maybe the most famous person in all of Israel, and now he is on the run and trying to hide. And the question is, when you're famous and everybody knows you, where do you go? And so David goes to a city of Nob, and at this time in the city of Nob was the tabernacle, and so there was the priests were attending to the tabernacle. And so David runs to the house of the Lord, and he runs to the priest. When he gets there, the priest Ahimelech is there. Now the priest can recognize something's off. David shouldn't be by himself. He should have a lot of people with him. And so Ahimelech is fearful of what this means and why David's here by himself. It says in verse 2, David said to Ahimelech the priest, The king has commissioned me with a matter that has said to me, Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you have found. David lies. And what we're going to get here in this story is David is really starting out on this venture of being on the run, of being a fugitive, trying to figure things out. David is going to make some mistakes. He's going to fail in some important ways. You know, one of the things that over the years that I've seen and that in counseling situations, when people have been sinned against or wronged, something similar to what David's going through here, right? Through no fault of his own, has Saul soured on him and now wants to kill him and has this murderous spirit towards him. David didn't do anything to deserve that, but David now finds himself in a position where he needs to be on the run. And you know, when somebody sins against you or somebody sins grievously against you, one of the things I always tell people is be very careful what you do next because you're being tested now. And it's not something you chose. It's not something that is coming on you necessarily even because of your own decisions or choices. But now you have a choice on what you're going to do next. And be very careful because there is a temptation in here. There's a test in here for you now. And that's the situation that David finds himself in. He's being tested. And some of the early results in this testing are going to be, he's going to fail at. So he lies to Ahimelech the priest here, and he says, I'm on a secret mission from the king. He wasn't. He was running from the king. And this lie is actually going to have really grievous consequences. We're going to find out in the next chapter that Saul is going to come and charge Ahimelech with treason, and he's going to slay all the priests that are there, save for one. And so this lie that David tells is going to cost Ahimelech his life and many other priests their lives. And in verse 22, David is going to, in verse 22 of 2 Samuel 20, or 1 Samuel 22, David is going to come to terms with the fact that some of this blood is on his hands. Ahimelech didn't know what was going on, so he said, Give me the food. The problem is there is no food there. Ahimelech, though, as overseeing the tabernacle, had what was called the showbread, which is 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel that would sit on this table before the Lord. And every Sabbath they would change it out, and after they changed it out, they could eat it. And so, in verse 4, the priest answered David and said, There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, the showbread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest and said to him, Surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more than today will their vessels be holy? This also isn't really true. David is lying again to Ahimelech, saying that they've been kept holy. David's the only one there. Now, there's some question whether there were actually men with David or not. Was David lying about this too? It tends to be understood that David was telling the truth, that there were men who were with him, that maybe Jonathan had sent after him or a contingent of guys that he was going to meet later. But he's trying to find resources, right? David's scrambling. He knows he's probably already starving. He's already probably under distress. And he knows he's going to have to go somewhere else where he doesn't know where his next meal is coming from. So he's trying to find some food, some sustenance for himself. The priest gave him the consecrated bread. Now, what's interesting about this is that Jesus brings this up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, if you turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 2, in verse 23, it says, and it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along, picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Jesus is making the point that when someone's in need, when they need mercy, the law is not designed to be the law in and of itself. In fact, the law is necessary. Sometimes it's necessary when you're in need for the law of mercy and the law of love to reign, and that's what's happening here. Now, interestingly, the bread is actually being taken off, and so it no longer is consecrated bread. It's no longer consecrated to the Lord. Now it's for the priest to eat, but only the priest is supposed to eat it, and so the priest gives it to David and his men. Then there's a second thing that happens here. It says, David said to Ahimelech, "Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent." Then the priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there is no other except it here." And David said, "There is none like it, give it to me." Now this is what is kind of remarkable, is David is lying to the priest, and he's in a bad spot. He's scared about what he's going to eat, where his next meal is going to come from, how is he going to protect himself. And so I don't know if you ever run that scenario in your mind of like, okay, you have 12 hours to flee, and like, where do you go? What do you do? That's the situation David's in, and it's a real life situation. He's on the run being hunted. And so his question is, how am I going to defend myself? Where am I going to get food from? What's interesting here is that David is really beginning to show some of the cracks in his faith, or some of the struggle with his faith, that he's wanting to trust in his own ability. He wants to trust in his own ability to be lying and cunning and get his way for his food. He also wants to trust in his own faith, his own skill as a warrior. And so, do you have a sword here? It's interesting, though, how God provides for him here. First, he feeds him from the showbread, the bread that was intended for God, and that God now is feeding David with it. And then he asked, "Do you have a sword or a spear, anything here?" And Ahimelech says, "We have the sword of the giant Goliath that you slew is behind the ephod." And David sees it and says, "Great, that's a great sword. There's none like it," and he takes it. But I don't think that's the message that God is trying to give to David. And I think later, as David has time to reflect on this, I think he's going to get the point that God was the one who delivered Goliath into his hands. If you remember what David says when he fights Goliath, he says, it's neither by sword or by spear that God delivers, but by the power of God. And so the sword that he's giving to the symbolism, the providence of God, that sword is here now, is not, it's a great sword. It's God's presence, God's grace, God's mercy, God's provision for you is available in times of need, in times of desperation, in times when you don't know what else to do. You can trust in God. You can walk by faith. And how cool is it that God had that bread for David and had that sword at that time for David? It's like this little sign that God's saying, "I'm with you, David. I'm going to be here with you." Well, David doesn't get it right away. In fact, he continues on. He goes into it says that he arose and fled from Saul that day and went to Achish, king of Gath. It's a pagan city. And it says, "But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one?' Then they danced, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s.' David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. He knew that once they knew who David was, that they would either kill him or take him prisoner. And so it says, so he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and left his saliva running down his beard." So he just pretended to be a madman. He pretended to be crazy. And again, this isn't really the way for a man of God to conduct himself. But David is kind of, in this moment, he's lost sight of the walk by faith of trusting in God. He's going to get it back. And David's life is certainly one of profound faith and profound trusting in God. But it's a really important point for us to take that when you're tested and when you go through very difficult times, your immediate response is really important. And you need to keep your eyes firm, fixedly on Jesus and say, God, I'm going to walk by faith. And God's going to provide for you in the same way that he provided for David. God bless you guys. We'll see the rest of this, the resolve of the situation in chapter 22.